I'm a historian, but I'm going to start by looking at the present day. So both of these images, well, this image here is from the National Black Republican Association's website, the nbra.info. So there is, within the last decade or so, an almost obsession with among conservatives, of a true history of the Republican Party, of black Republicans and the role in it. Dinesh D'Souza has even made an entire documentary on this topic of a true history. And if you go to the NBRA's website, you'll see not just modern day politics, but you'll see a civil rights history test, the true history of the civil rights explained link. You'll also see this meme here. Did you know every one of these famous civil rights figures was a Republican? So the top three, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman, are all from a different era of politics, as is George Washington Carver. And then the last two people on the list, Mary McLeod Bethune and A. Philip Randolph, aren't even Republicans. Mary McLeod Bethune is a New Deal Democrat, and A. Philip Randolph is a socialist. And the NBRA also, about a decade ago, launched a massive billboard campaign, purchasing over 50 billboards across the country. Pictured here, Did You Know Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican? Of course, all this history, it might be right about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman voting Republican at one time during an age of a different Republican Party. But of course, this is very misleading history, right? There is an obsession of history among modern day black Republicans. Candace Owens is very frequently talking about a true, quote unquote, true history of black Republicans and a true history of the civil rights movement that includes significant Republican participation. But you'll also notice from this list here, there's no one actually from the civil rights era on this list. You'll also notice, if you know anything about black politics in the 1960s, the most powerful African American in the country was Edward Brooke, a Republican from Massachusetts who was a United States Senator. And he's curiously also missing from this list. So I don't think it's just ignorance on the part of contemporary black Republicans, at least who make up the NBRA, and individuals like Dinesh D'Souza who have a definitive agenda about restructuring and redefining history. There's something deliberate in this. There's something intentional in this history. And indeed, you couldn't have or at least from the NBRA's perspective, if they included the real history of black Republicans in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, it would be an indictment on the Republican Party. It would be an indictment on modern conservatism. Because indeed, if you look at black Republicans from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 1970s, the most influential ones call themselves, self-identify by the term liberal, self-identify by the term progressive. And indeed, if you look at who they define as their enemies, their political enemies, their enemies aren't always Democrats. Their enemies are Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and conservatives within their own party. And oftentimes, to many black Republicans, their political fights aren't with Democrats. Their political fights are with other Republicans, and Republicans who are attempting to push them out of power. A secondary story of black Republicans during the Civil Rights era is also the story of not just how African Americans became alienated from the Republican Party, but how African Americans were structurally pushed out of the Republican Party and excluded from participation in Republican leadership positions. So to have that story is a very different story. And thus, if you take out that story, you're left with this, right? You're left with this history that isn't really history, that's a false narrative of something that happened. All right, but I'm a historian, so we're going to go back in time now. So we're going to Louisville, Kentucky in the year 1960. And in Louisville, Kentucky, 1960 is an election year. You have the young, idealistic John F. Kennedy running as a Democrat versus Richard Nixon, the Republican. And in Louisville, On election day in November 1960, black voters in Louisville vote the same as black voters really across the country in terms of support for John F. Kennedy. About 70% of black voters in Louisville will cast ballots for John F. Kennedy, which is about the average in the nation. There are places where there are exceptions to this, Atlanta being one of them. The majority of black voters in Atlanta in 1960 vote for Richard Nixon. But Louisville voters, if you're just looking at presidential voting data, black Louisvillians, they are Democrats. It's not just that they vote for John F. Kennedy, it's an overwhelming victory for John F. Kennedy. And indeed, if you look at the history of sort of black politics, there is a meta-narrative of, since 1932, African Americans have been the most solid Democratic voting bloc in the nation. And if you're just looking at presidents, that's 100% true. There has not been a single president on a national level who has won the majority of black voters since 1928. But if you go to Louisville in 1960 and you take off that top ballot, you take off that top race, and you move down to the second race, the race for the United States Senate. Running for Senate in Kentucky is a Republican by the name of John Sherman Cooper. And Kentucky has a unique political arrangement, the same as Tennessee does, where you have white Republicans in the mountains, and they have historically voted Republicans in the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky. And you have Republicans who form an electoral coalition between those white Appalachians and African Americans from Louisville. And John Sherman Cooper sees his victory in Kentucky for the United States Senate coming from Appalachians, of which he is one of them, and black voters, especially from Louisville, Kentucky's largest city and largest concentration of African Americans in the state. So John Sherman Cooper actively campaigns in black churches in Louisville. John Sherman Cooper endorses civil rights. John Sherman Cooper endorses desegregation. This is also the year of the sit-ins. John Sherman Cooper reaches out and makes contact with African American leaders. The president of the Louisville branch of the NAACP, Charles Lunderman, is a campaign advisor for John Sherman Cooper. And on election day, the same election where John F. Kennedy won 70% of black voters in Louisville, John Sherman Cooper wins 85% of black voters in Louisville. That's a different picture than the overarching narrative that African Americans have been solidly Democratic since 1932. And indeed, if you move down from a national level to a state and local level, the picture is a whole lot more complex than just looking at presidential voting data might lead us to believe. So, indeed, if you look at the grassroots level in Louisville, you'll see 1960 is the year of the sit-ins. The sit-ins begin in February 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they spread throughout the South. By the end of 1960, there have been over 500 students arrested in Louisville alone for participation in direct action protest, such as the students here who are protesting at the segregated Blue Boar restaurant in Louisville. As we enter into 1961, the sit-in movement continues, and the sit-in movement represents this new phase of student activism and direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience. And it particularly targets private businesses, and its goal is to put pressure on businessmen. In Louisville in 1961, you have the continuation of those sit-ins, but you also have a parallel movement. And that parallel movement in Louisville is a voter registration drive. There's a voter registration drive because there's an election in 1961, a municipal election. We're not talking about John F. Kennedy or United States Senate. This is a city election. Right? And in this city election, who is up for contention is the mayor and the board of aldermen. And Louisville, as of 1961, is a city who has a Democratic mayor who paints himself as a moderate, but on the issue of integration, quote-unquote forced integration, as opposed to voluntary integration. Forced integration is a step too far for him. And thus there is not a single even proposal in the Board of Aldermen for a new city ordinance to desegregate the city. So civil rights activists in Louisville, particularly middle class middle-aged activist, so the president of the NAACP, who is also a Republican, as I mentioned. Also the head of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. His name is Reverend C. Eubank Tucker, and he's also a Republican, as a side note. They formed together a separate movement in Louisville that's going to work in conjunction with the sit-ins, and that's to register, their goal is to register 50,000 new black voters in the city. And the explicit goal is to kick out Democratic Mayor Bruce Hoblitzel, who has made it clear that he is not going to integrate the city. All right, so in the summer of 1961, Martin Luther King visits Louisville and he participates in a parade. And the parade is part of the voter registration kickoff drive. And throughout the rest of the summer and fall of 1961, there's indeed a massive voter registration drive. It's one of the largest in the country. And they successfully succeed their plan of registering 50,000 new black voters. So come fall 1961, and we come to the election, and it is a clean Republican sweep. Mayor Bruce Hoblitzel is removed from power. Every single Democrat on the Board of Aldermen is replaced by a Republican, and we have a city now that is 100% in control by Republicans. And among those Board of Aldermen members are African Americans as well. And true to their promise, the newly elected Republican mayor and the Republican Board of Aldermen passed the South's first public ordinance that desegregates a city passed in a southern city. And it would not have happened had it not been for black participation within the Republican Party in this instance. Also in that year, in 1961, we have the election of the first African-American woman elected to a state legislature, Amelia Tucker. She's the wife of the director of Louisville's CORE, C. Eubank Tucker. And so there's also a black Republican participation in the Kentucky General Assembly as well. All right, so we're gonna fast forward again, 3 years later in Kentucky. 3 years later, there is a new drive in Kentucky for a statewide civil rights ordinance. And there have been multiple variations of this law that have been proposed before the Kentucky General Assembly since 1963, but black activists see 1964, this is their year. And so in the spring of 1964, there is a March on Frankfort movement. Martin Luther King again returns to Kentucky. This time he's marching on Frankfort, and he's marching on Frankfort to put pressure on state legislators to pass this law. You'll also notice accompanying Martin Luther King to Frankfort is Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson is not just the baseball all-star. Jackie Robinson is also probably the most famous black Republican of the 1960s. Jackie Robinson campaigned with Richard Nixon in 1960, and by this time in 1964, Jackie Robinson is in the cabinet of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. So Jackie Robinson comes not just to join this march, but he also comes to work behind the scenes to let Republican legislators know that if they want money from Nelson Rockefeller come next election, one way to do it is to vote for this bill. If they want Eastern establishment sort of backing, which you might think doesn't appeal to the South, but it does appeal to a number of moderate Republicans from Louisville and Lexington and other major cities. And so he's working behind the scenes as well in his capacity as a representative of Nelson Rockefeller. So the bill eventually passes the Kentucky General Assembly, and it goes to the desk of Kentucky Governor Ned Breathitt. Ned Breathitt is a Democrat, and Ned Breathitt, again, is just like the mayor of Louisville, is a moderate style Southern Democrat. Initially, he's opposed to integration, but reluctantly, he signs this bill. And this becomes the South's first civil rights bill passed on a state level. So if you read any works on the history of Kentucky and the history of civil rights in Kentucky, it almost exclusively focuses on Ned Breathitt. Ned Breathitt as this representative of a sort of new Democrat, a new progressive Democrat who came to the light in 1964, who brings forth a new political party. But if you actually look at the legislative history of it, Ned Breathitt is a Johnny-come-lately to it. Ned Breathitt is there only at the very end of the story. The bill begins and ends and all the way in the middle with Jesse Waters. Jesse Waters is a black Republican state legislator from Louisville who wrote the bill, who sponsored the bill, and for 6 months works tirelessly wheeling and dealing behind the scenes with fellow Republicans in order to secure their support for the bill. Without Jesse Waters, this bill would not have passed, would not have even reached the desk of Ned Breathitt. So the story of Louisville, if you, as many historians and political scientists do, if you're just looking at 1960 and you're just looking at John F. Kennedy, and you go, all right, 70% of black voters vote for John F. Kennedy in 1960, and then 4 years later, in 1964, 90% of black voters vote for Lyndon Johnson, you're going to come away with the picture that Louisville is a solidly Democratic city, right? But if you look at the grassroots level, it's a completely different picture. And one statistic, one thing I forgot to mention, is that as of 1962, 64% of registered black voters in Louisville are registered Republican. So when John F. Kennedy gets elected in 1960, he is elected by black Republicans from Kentucky, right? Which is a different story, right? It's a more nuanced story, and it's a story that points to the importance of state and local and grassroots political organization to understanding black partisanship. So you see this, Louisville is not an anomaly among southern cities in terms of active black Republican participation. Memphis is another city. Memphis is a city that, just Tennessee in general, is very similar to Kentucky in the sense of there is a biracial partnership between white Appalachians and African Americans in the state's largest city of Memphis. So in Memphis, since the 1920s, the Memphis Republican Party has by and large been controlled by African Americans. In the 1920s, Robert Church Jr. assumes control of the Memphis Republican Party. Robert Church Jr. is the son of the city's first black banker, and he is the wealthiest African American in the country. And thus, he is vitally important to funding the Republican Party itself in Tennessee. He is the #1 financial contributor to the Republican Party in Tennessee. He also funds sort of skeletal Republican parties in Memphis and Alabama. Not only is Robert Church active in the Republican Party, he is also involved in the civil rights. He's a civil rights man. He is good friends with James Weldon Johnson, and Robert Church personally funds the expansion of the NAACP throughout the Deep South in places that could not afford the institutional support that's provided by Robert Church. So Robert Church will be a delegate to 8 Republican National Conventions. He will control the allotment of federal patronage in Western Tennessee for decades. By the 1950s, he's getting elderly, and he moves to Chicago, and he hands over the reins to his lieutenant, George W. Lee. And George W. Lee is at the far right. He's the African-American man on the far right of that picture, alongside the white man on the far right, Millsaps Fitzhugh, who's a white moderate businessman from Memphis. And throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, George W. Lee is the Republican, is his nickname in Memphis is Mr. Republican, is Mr. Republican in Memphis. And not only does George W. Lee lead the Republican Party in Memphis, he also has a significant sway over black voters in Memphis. Memphis black voters in 1956 vote for Dwight Eisenhower. In 1960, they vote for Richard Nixon. George W. Lee has great structural and institutional and grassroots organization behind him. George W. Lee, like Robert Church, is also an advocate for civil rights as well. In 1960, the year of the sit-ins, the Republican Party of Memphis passes a resolution that endorses the sit-in movement. The sit-in movement is just the acts of civil disobedience are anathema to most white Southerners, and for a political party to endorse the sit-ins, it's quite the statement in 1960. All right, so that's Memphis. You also see a strong black Republican presence in Atlanta as well. John H. Calhoun, for a number of years, serves variably as the president of the city's NAACP and also the president of the city's also as the president of the city's Republican Party. C.A. Scott's Atlanta Daily World syndicate is solidly Republican for decades and decades, well into the 1960s and 70s. Also, you see a black Republican presence in Democratic strongholds as well, in places where African Americans are pretty solidly Democratic. So in Chicago, one of the city's most esteemed ministers is Archibald Carey Jr. Archibald Carey Jr. is the minister of Woodlawn AME Church. And it is from Woodlawn AME Church in the 1940s that CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, is founded. It is first founded in Archibald Carey's personal office. Archibald Carey's church also serves as the meeting place for the first national convention of the Congress of Racial Equality. James Farmer, the longtime national director of CORE, refers to Archibald Carey as the patron saint of CORE. Archibald Carey is also the vice president of the city's NAACP throughout the 1950s as well. Archibald Carey is also a Republican, and he is a Republican member of the Chicago Board of Aldermen. And through his presence on the Board of Aldermen, he secures passage of an expansion of public housing, the creation of the Chicago Council on Human Relations. But his number one issue during his 8 years as alderman is integration of housing. And every year that he is an alderman, he proposes what Democrats label the Carey Ordinance, or an ordinance that would ban the sale or rental of property through discriminatory means. If you know Chicago, you know that this will never pass. You know that he doesn't succeed in this. But for a decade, he is the only elected politician in the city of Chicago that is adamantly behind this issue of open housing. The New Republic magazine, not a conservative magazine by any sort, did a profile of Carey in the late 1940s and called him the nation's most vigorous fighter for progressive urban reform. Carey is also selected by Dwight Eisenhower as a keynote speaker at the 1952 Republican National Convention, where he concludes his speech with the lines that you see on the screen here. Many historians credit this speech in 1952 as a partial inspiration for Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. If the words sound familiar, that's where they are in part coming from. So Archibald Carey, again, this is a Republican, but he's a Republican of a very different sort than a contemporary national narrative of who is a black Republican. Archibald Carey is joined in Chicago by T.R.M. Howard. Briefly, T.R.M. Howard is from Mississippi, and he rises to national prominence following the lynching of Emmett Till. Howard invites Mamie Till to his house, and she will stay at his house during her duration in Mississippi. Here, Howard is also with Chicago Representative Charles Diggs, who also stays with Howard. Following the miscarriage of justice in the Till case, Howard goes on a national tour in 1956, and the national tour is sponsored by the Republican Party, and essentially the crux of his tour is saying it is Democrats in Mississippi that are responsible for this miscarriage of justice. It's Democrats to blame. He eventually flees Mississippi because of death threats to him and his family, and he goes to Chicago, and he joins Archibald Carey in promoting Republican politics and opposing the political machine of Richard Daley. Dr. Howard, he's a medical doctor. He also sees as part of his civil rights agenda access to abortion to black women. He is Chicago's #1 abortion provider in the 1960s and 70s. And many of these abortions are illegal, and many of the abortions are also given to white women as well. So his vision of civil rights expands beyond race and beyond and into gender. And again, this is not a person who contemporary black Republicans are going to highlight, right? So that's TRM Howard. There are also a plethora on the state level of state legislators who successfully secure passage of state-level civil rights bills. So we'll just do a few here. Hobson Reynolds. Hobson Reynolds is also the grand exalted ruler of the Black Elks. Here is Hobson Reynolds in a elk parade featuring him and Martin Luther King. The Black Elks are an important financial institute that funds much of the civil rights movement and civil rights activities. Hobson Reynolds is also a Republican state legislator from Philadelphia who secures a fair employment law in Philadelphia. Richard McLean is a black dentist from Cincinnati who desegregates Ohio State during his term in the Ohio State Legislature. Harry Cole is the first black state senator from Maryland who successfully secures Maryland's civil rights bill. Robert Lee Brockenburr is an African-American state senator from Indianapolis who successfully pushes through the 1963 Indiana Civil Rights Bill. And there are more and more people who I could mention on this list in terms of state-level activists. The most prominent and most powerful black Republican on the scene during the civil rights era, though, is Edward Brooke. Edward Brooke is first elected to a statewide office in 1962. He's elected to be Attorney General of Massachusetts. In this capacity, he is the highest-ranking black state official in the country. 4 years later, in 1966, Edward Brooke becomes the first African-American elected to the United States Senate by popular vote. He is also the first African-American senator from the North as well. During his first year in the Senate, Edward Brooke is devoted and most passionate about one issue, and that one issue is open housing, getting rid of discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And in proposing this bill, his open housing bill, he is putting pressure on Republicans to make a stand on open housing. When he continues to propose this bill in 1968, he is forcing both presidential candidates and people who are running for office on a national level to take a stand on open housing. When Martin Luther King is assassinated in April of 1968 on a Thursday, the following Sunday, Edward Brooke is a guest on NBC's Meet the Press. And on NBC's Meet the Press, Edward Brooke tells his Republican and Democratic colleagues in Congress, if you truly want to honor King's legacy, pass my open housing bill. True to form, it passes, and this becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1968, or the Open Housing Bill, which is the last of the three major pieces of civil rights legislation of the 1960s. And Edward Brooke, a black Republican, is working constantly behind the scenes to ensure its passage and pressuring for a year his Republican colleagues. Throughout the rest of his tenure and the rest of the 1960s, he's reelected in 1972. Edward Brooke becomes a continual and a constant supporter of expansions of women's rights, expansions of health care and healthcare opportunities through Medicare and Medicaid. He's also a major proponent of fair rent laws and an increase in public housing and standards in public housing as well. So yeah, there are black Republicans, and they have an important role, and they played an important role for decades in terms of supporting and sponsoring civil rights legislation. But why were they Republicans in the first place? Right? They could have done similar things as Democrats, and maybe even easier if Edward Brooke was a Democrat to secure laws. Number one, there is a strong belief among black Republicans towards the economic agenda of the Republican Party as it relates to capitalism and free enterprise. That is something we can talk about in questions and answers if y'all want to. But secondly, there's also among black Republicans a pragmatism that transcends ideology in terms of why specifically they're Republican. So number one, they would emphasize the value of the two-party system, the value of, if they are Republicans, it not just pressures Republicans to be for civil rights, it also puts pressure on Democrats. So in the city of Louisville, it puts pressure not just on Republicans to endorse it, but the next time a Democratic mayor runs for office, he knows that black voters are a powerful voting bloc that he has to actively win. And secondly, an argument frequently made by black Republicans is they want to shape the Republican Party and shape who the Republican Party nominates. And thus that requires black voters to reward white Republicans who acquiesce to civil rights. So pictured here is George Romney, who is participating in an NAACP protest of a segregated suburb of Detroit. And black Republicans in Michigan make the argument of, if we don't vote for George Romney, then the Republicans are going to nominate someone a whole lot more conservative who's not going to be our ally in the future. And thus we need to encourage Republicans to continue supporting people like George Romney or Nelson Rockefeller. Increasingly by the 1960s, part of the fight for civil rights among black Republicans is also a message against their own party. Increasingly by 1968, the reason why a number of black Republicans stay Republican is because they argue that if they ever left the party, they are the conscience of the party. And if they leave the party, they are abandoning the party to Barry Goldwater, to Ronald Reagan. And thus they're sort of the last line of defense against the rise of conservatives within the party and anti-civil rights conservatives at that. So by the 1960s, black Republicans are competing not just against Democrats, but they're also competing against a conservative movement within their own party. By the early 1960s, there's massive grassroots mobilization among conservatives to take over, to use the Republican Party as a vehicle of the conservative movement, as an ideological movement. And part of this requires sort of structural changes in the Republican Party. The Republican Party, for 20 years now, has been largely controlled by the quote-unquote Eastern establishment, who Phyllis Schlafly, a conservative grassroots activist, calls the kingmakers, these pinstripe New Yorkers who think they can direct the shape of the Republican Party. So the draft Goldwater movement is a movement in the 1960s to ensure that a true conservative is representative of the Republican Party. So this is going to require a structural sort of change in the makeup of the Republican Party. So you'll see sort of a conservative takeover of young Republicans, a conservative takeover of the Federation of Republican Women, and you'll also see a conservative movement inside the Republican National Committee as well. In 1961, the new chairman of the Republican National Committee is a man by the name of William Miller. And William Miller, in one of his very first acts as the new chairman, defunds the RNC's Minorities Division. The RNC's Minorities Division, since the 1950s, has been very adequately funded. And throughout the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration, it is a major place of support that provides black Republicans with funding, with literature, and institutional help. Now that it has essentially been eviscerated from the Republican National Committee, it leaves grassroots Republicans without institutional support. In place of the Minorities Division, William Miller amps up funding for a project started in the 1950s called Operation Dixie. And Operation Dixie is a program designed to appeal to quote-unquote new leaders in the South. And by new in that instance is also racially coded language as well. If black Republicans are the old leaders and you're talking about new leaders, you are talking about replacing old African American leadership with new white leadership as well. And so Operation Dixie, the RNC pumps tens of thousands of dollars into Operation Dixie that will fund candidates like William Workman, a United States Senate candidate from South Carolina who runs an openly racist campaign. Operation Dixie will also fund on the grassroots level a number of sort of these new Republicans who are actively working against black Republicans in the South. All right, so one of the reasons why Chairman Miller and Operation Dixie want to revamp and restructure Southern Republican parties is because central to the draft Goldwater movement is Barry Goldwater needs delegates. And historically, one of the centers of one of the centers of Eastern establishment support has been Southern African Americans. So Black Republicans stand in the way of a potential Barry Goldwater nomination. So throughout 1962, 1963, and 1964, you see what Jet Magazine describes as the Great Purge of Negroes from G.O.P hierarchy in Dixie. You see in Atlanta, there is a concerted movement among conservatives to erase Black Republicans from positions of leadership. And by the time we get to 1964, Georgia, for the first time in 50 years, will send an all-white delegation to the Republican National Committee and a solidly committed Barry Goldwater delegation to the Republican National Committee. In Memphis is that city where the Republican Party since the 1920s has been controlled by Black Republicans, and in the 1950s it had been controlled by George W. Lee. By the 1960s, there's a movement among conservatives in Memphis to take power from George W. Lee. To take power from George W. Lee, though, was not going to be an easy task. He has grassroots support in the city of Memphis. Beginning in 1962, there is a Goldwater supporter by the name of Robert James. Robert James is a member of the James Birch Society, an art conservative, anti-civil rights organization. And Robert James sees Goldwater as the future of the South. And he sees Goldwater as the last sort of holdout, if you want to preserve segregation and an anti-civil rights agenda. So Robert James, he can't take over. He doesn't have enough grassroots support in Memphis among conservatives to take over the party from George W. Lee. So instead he forms a parallel Republican organization, an unofficial Republican party in Memphis called the Shelby County Republican Association, which is different from the Memphis Republican Party, which is the official party controlled by George W. Lee. So the Shelby County Republican Association meets in the famed and segregated Peabody Hotel in Memphis. And throughout the year 1962, they canvass businessmen, members of the John Birch Society, members of the White Citizens Council, telling them the future is in Barry Goldwater, and if you join the Shelby County Republican Association, we'll take over the Republican Party of Memphis, and we will send a Barry Goldwater delegation to the Republican National Committee, and that will help ensure Goldwater's nomination. And we'll also change the makeup of the Republican Party of Memphis, and we'll finally have a vehicle that conservatives are in control of, and that conservatives can direct and drive. So by 1963, Robert James has amassed enough support in his Shelby County Republican Association, and in 1963, at a meeting of the Republican Party of Memphis, those conservatives take power in Memphis. They kick out George W. Lee. They kick out Ben Hooks. Benjamin Hooks is the eventual national director of the NAACP. At this time, he's a Republican in Memphis. They are expelled from the party. George W. Lee, though, is not one to go down without a fight. And George W. Lee knows that he has grassroots support. So now the official party of Memphis is controlled by conservatives. Now it's George W. Lee's turn. He forms his own auxiliary Republican group. And this Republican group is going to meet throughout 1963 and in 1964 to rally Black voters to register as Republican, and if you're a Democrat, switch your ballot, because we've got to take over this Republican Party from conservatives. And he's galvanized thousands of Black voters to participate in the 1964 Memphis caucuses that are going to select delegates to send to the Republican National Convention. So come Election Day, thousands of Black voters in Memphis come out to the caucus meetings. When they go to their precincts meetings, however, their precinct locations have been moved at the last minute. Their precinct, in every single Black precinct in Memphis, the new location of the caucus meeting is in a segregated business of someone affiliated with the new Memphis Republican Party. All right, so you have thousands of people who are coming out to vote, and are literally disenfranchised by their own party, right? And this is all kind of quasi-legal because parties control their own how they execute elections. So George W. Lee now shifts his focus towards fighting this clear case of disenfranchisement before the Republican National Convention in San Francisco. And George W. Lee appears in San Francisco. He has lawyers paid for by Nelson Rockefeller. And during 3 hours of live coverage by the national media, George W. Lee appears before the Republican National Convention's Credentials Committee. And he makes a compelling case that black voters in Memphis were disenfranchised from the political process. Not only are the new members of the Memphis Republican Party, they were just Democrats a year ago, and they're members of racist organizations, but even more so, they obtain their power through discrimination. So the Credentials Committee hears his arguments, and they hand down their decision where they declare, quote, any agreement or accommodation with Mr. Lee will result in no benefit to the Republican Party. The Credentials Committee has been stacked by Barry Goldwater supporters, and they turned down Lee's delegation. And for the first time in 60 years, Memphis sends an all-white delegation to the Republican National Convention. Jack Craddock, who will eventually become the chairman of the Memphis Republican Party, proudly told reporters that day that the Memphis Republican Party is now, quote, a white Republican Party. He later reminisces in an oral history interview, and he's thinking back on San Francisco and defeating Lee, and he tells an interviewer, we loved it because it was all on TV. They seated our delegates. Lee sort of went fishing after that. That's when our party came around. So again, it's not the story of, say, 1964, and the story of black Republicans is not just a story of African Americans being ideologically alienated from the Republican Party. It is in part that, but it is also the story of a systematic purge, as Jet Magazine refers to it, systematic purge of African Americans from party ranks. I'm running low on time, so I'll speed this up. After 1964, you see a mass desertion of black Republicans from the party. In Atlanta, a city that voted for Richard Nixon, among African Americans in 1960, 99.6% of black voters in 1964 vote for Lyndon Johnson. You see a similar percentage in Memphis as well. So in two places where just 4 years prior, where 2 years prior, where 3 years prior, black Republicans had a strong presence, now they are virtually solidly Democrat, at least in terms of national voting records. Nationally, you also see Goldwater have the lowest black support of any Republican candidate in history. There are some black Republicans who will stay inside the party and continue for the next 20 years to fight an increasingly uphill battle against conservatives within their own party. But there are some accomplishments of African Americans during the years post-1964. Robert J. Brown is an aide to Richard Nixon. He successfully secures hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding for HBCUs and for sickle cell anemia research. Arthur Fletcher is Richard Nixon's Assistant Secretary of Labor. He earns the moniker the father of affirmative action for instilling affirmative action programs within the federal government. William Coleman Jr. will be Gerald Ford's Secretary of Transportation, where he will also further entrench affirmative action in federal policies in terms of allotment of contracts. By 1980, however, you see the culmination of the conservative movement with the nomination and election of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan's ascendance marks the ultimate decline of traditional black Republicans of the civil rights era. There exist into the 1980s and into the 1990s black Republicans who don't toe a Republican conservative line, who, on issues of civil rights, are very much in favor of affirmative action, are very much in favor of a progressive civil rights agenda. However, within the structures of the Reagan administration and the RNC of the 1980s, those African Americans, people like Arthur Fletcher and William Coleman and Robert Brown of the Nixon years, they're no longer being promoted to any offices within the party. Instead, there's a new generation of Black Republicans, people like Clarence Thomas and Clarence Pendleton, who are devotedly against affirmative action, are devotedly against race-conscious policies, and they fall right in line with the ideology of the president. So there exist Black Republicans who are of a previous generation. They're just not being promoted anymore within the party. And this is another structural impediment that that limits the opportunities for Black Republicans. Because if Black Republicans don't toe a very specific conservative ideological line, they're quickly removed from party ranks in terms of positions of importance. And generally speaking, that's where I end in 1980, but the case is very similar to Black Republicans today. There's an emphasis on ideological purity in terms of towing the official party line in terms of advancement within party ranks. I made my time, Andrew.